September 15, 1940, 11,000 feet above Kent, England. Flight Lieutenant James "Ginger" Lacey of RAF Squadron 501 rolled his Supermarine Spitfire into a tight turn following a Messerschmitt Bf 109 that had just made the fatal mistake of trying to outturn him at low altitude. The German pilot, Oberleutnant Werner Milder's wingman, was flying one of the Luftwaffe's finest fighters. On paper, the Bf 109 was superior to the Spitfire in almost every measurable way. It was faster in level flight. It could dive faster. It could climb faster. It had a more powerful engine and heavier armament. Yet here, in the twisting, turning combat above the English countryside, none of that mattered. The Messerschmitt, despite its technical advantages, couldn't follow the Spitfire through the turn. The German fighter's turn radius was wider. Its turn rate was slower, and most critically, its pilot was fighting an opponent who understood something the Luftwaffe's engineers had missed. Speed isn't everything. In fact, sometimes speed is nothing. Lacey's Spitfire completed the turn a full 3 seconds before the Messerschmitt. 3 seconds. In aerial combat, that's an eternity. It's the difference between hunter and prey, between life and death, between victory and a smoking crater in a Kent pasture. Lacey's 8 Browning machine guns spoke for exactly 2 seconds. The Messerschmitt's fuel tank, located behind the pilot without adequate protection, exploded. The German pilot never escaped. His technically superior fighter became a fireball that illuminated the same sky where, 2 weeks earlier, Winston Churchill had proclaimed, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." What Lacey understood, what every experienced Spitfire pilot learned, was that the numbers in the technical specifications told only part of the story. The Messerschmitt might be faster, but the Spitfire was better. Better at the things that actually mattered in combat. Better at keeping pilots alive. Better at winning fights. The German pilots, many of them veterans of Poland, France, and Norway, couldn't understand it. How were the supposedly inferior British fighters defeating their technologically advanced Messerschmitts? How were British pilots, many of them barely out of training, outfighting Luftwaffe veterans with hundreds of combat hours? The answer lay not in horsepower or top speed, but in a fundamental difference in design philosophy. The British had built a fighter that prioritized the things that mattered in real combat. The Germans had built a fighter that prioritized the things that looked impressive in specifications. The difference between these approaches would determine the outcome of the Battle of Britain and ultimately the course of World War II. The philosophy. British pragmatism versus German engineering. The story begins not in 1940 but in 1934 when the British Air Ministry issued Specification F.7/30 calling for a new fighter aircraft. The specification emphasized maneuverability, rate of climb, and pilot visibility. Top speed was listed as important but not paramount. R.J. Mitchell, the chief designer at Supermarine Aviation, approached the problem from a pilot's perspective. He'd learned flying during World War I. He understood that aerial combat wasn't about flying fast in a straight line. It was about turning, climbing, positioning, seeing the enemy before he saw you. Mitchell's Spitfire, first flown in March 1936, embodied this philosophy. Its elliptical wing, expensive and difficult to manufacture, provided exceptional lift across a wide speed range. Its thin wing profile reduced drag. Its wide track landing gear made it stable on the ground. Its bubble canopy provided panoramic visibility. Most critically, Mitchell designed the Spitfire to be harmonious to fly. All the controls worked together naturally. The aircraft responded to pilot inputs predictably and smoothly. It didn't have bad habits or dangerous characteristics. A pilot could focus on fighting rather than fighting the aircraft. The Germans took a different approach. Willy Messerschmitt, designing the Bf 109 for the Luftwaffe, prioritized performance metrics that impressed procurement committees. Top speed, rate of climb, and ceiling. These numbers looked good on paper and made politicians believe they were buying superior technology. The Bf 109 that resulted was indeed fast. The E model, entering service in 1939, could reach 355 miles per hour in level flight, about 20 miles per hour faster than the contemporary Spitfire Mark I. It could climb to 20,000 feet in 7.5 minutes, about 30 seconds faster than the Spitfire. But these advantages came with costs that didn't show up in specifications. The Bf 109's narrow-track landing gear made it dangerous to land and take off. Hundreds of Messerschmitts were lost in landing accidents that never would have happened with the Spitfire's wider gear. The Bf 109's heavy armament made it nose-heavy, requiring constant trim adjustment. Its cramped cockpit and limited visibility meant pilots often didn't see threats until too late. Most critically, the Messerschmitt's wing design, optimized for high speed, made it inferior at the lower speeds where most combat actually occurred. The Bf 109 had a higher wing loading, meaning more weight per square foot of wing area. This made it faster in level flight but worse at turning. The mathematics were unforgiving. At 300 miles per hour, the Spitfire could complete a full 360-degree turn in about 22 seconds. The Bf 109 needed about 28 seconds. 6 seconds slower might not sound like much, but in aerial combat it was catastrophic. In those 6 seconds, the Spitfire pilot could position for a killing shot, while the Messerschmitt pilot was still trying to complete his turn. German test pilots who flew captured Spitfires understood this immediately. Oberleutnant Heinz Knock, after flying a captured Spitfire in 1941, reported that the British fighter's maneuverability is extraordinary. In turning combat below 4,000 meters, it is clearly superior to our Bf 109. The Spitfire pilot can turn inside us every time, but this information never influenced German fighter design. The Luftwaffe continued prioritizing speed and climb rate over maneuverability. They continued believing that technical specifications on paper translated to superiority in combat. They were wrong. August 1940. The proof begins. The Battle of Britain officially began on July 10, 1940, but the decisive phase started in August when the Luftwaffe began massive attacks on RAF airfields. This was where theory met reality, where design philosophies were tested in blood and fire. On August 13th, Adlertag, Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe launched over 1,400 sorties against British targets. RAF Fighter Command scrambled to intercept with fewer than 700 fighters, roughly half Spitfires and half Hurricanes. The Germans expected to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and superior aircraft. What happened instead shocked German commanders. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, RAF fighters achieved roughly equal loss rates. The Luftwaffe lost 45 aircraft to Fighter Command's 13. More critically, the psychological impact favored the British. German pilots, expecting easy victories, found themselves in desperate fights for survival. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, commanding 85 Squadron Flying Hurricanes, recorded the experience. The Messerschmitts had speed and firepower advantages, but when they tried to dogfight with us, they were at a disadvantage. We could turn inside them. We could outclimb them in a sustained climb. Most importantly, we could see them coming while they struggled to see us. The visibility difference was particularly significant. The Spitfire's bubble canopy and slim nose provided excellent forward and upward visibility. Pilots could spot enemy aircraft at long range and track them throughout combat. The Bf 109's heavier framing and broader nose created blind spots. German pilots often lost sight of their opponents during turning fights. Flight Lieutenant Alan Deere, a New Zealander flying Spitfires with 5-4 Squadron, described a typical encounter. "I saw the 109s coming from above. They dived on us expecting to blow through our formation, shoot down a few Spitfires, and escape using their speed. But we turned into them. They couldn't follow. They tried to climb away, but we were already climbing with them. 2 didn't make it. The German tactic of diving, shooting, and escaping worked when they achieved surprise. But when RAF pilots saw them coming, which happened increasingly often as British radar and observer corps improved, the speed advantage became irrelevant. The Messerschmitts entered turning fights they couldn't win. By late August, Luftwaffe intelligence was receiving troubling reports. Morale among fighter pilots was declining. Loss rates were higher than expected. British fighters, particularly the Spitfire, were proving more formidable than anticipated. Major Adolf Galland, one of Germany's leading aces, flew several missions over Britain in August. His after-action reports noted that British fighters, especially the Spitfire, must not be underestimated. Their maneuverability gives them significant advantages in combat below 5,000 meters. Our speed advantage is insufficient to offset this. Galland's reports were accurate but ignored. German leadership, committed to their belief in technical superiority, couldn't accept that their faster, more heavily armed fighters might be inferior where it mattered. They blamed pilot skill, tactics, and numbers rather than recognizing fundamental design differences. The turn rate, physics versus engineering. To understand why the Spitfire could outturn the Bf 109, we need to examine the physics of turning flight. An aircraft turns by banking and applying lift perpendicular to the wings. The tighter the turn, the more G-force the pilot experiences and the more lift the wings must generate. The limiting factor in turning performance is wing loading, the aircraft's weight divided by wing area. Lower wing loading means more wing area supporting each pound of weight, which means more available lift for turning. The Spitfire Mark I had a wing area of 242 square feet and a loaded weight of around 6,000 pounds, giving it a wing loading of about 25 pounds per square foot. The Bf 109E had a wing area of 174 square feet and a loaded weight of around 5,500 pounds, giving it a wing loading of about 32 pounds per square foot. This 30% higher wing loading meant the Messerschmitt needed 30% more speed to generate the same lift. At the same speed, the Spitfire could turn tighter. To match the Spitfire's turn rate, the Messerschmitt pilot had to fly faster, which increased his turn radius even more. The Spitfire's elliptical wing provided another advantage. Its shape produced consistent lift across the entire wing span, delaying the onset of tip stall during high G maneuvers. The Bf 109's straight tapered wing experienced tip stall earlier, making the aircraft more difficult to control at high angles of attack. British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew more aircraft types than perhaps anyone in history, explained the difference clearly. The Spitfire's low wing loading and efficient wing design gave it a sustained turn rate that the Bf 109 simply couldn't match. In a turning fight, the Spitfire pilot could maintain his turn indefinitely, while the Messerschmitt pilot either had to break off or risk stalling. German pilots developed tactics to avoid turning fights. The standard procedure was boom and zoom, diving from altitude to make a single firing pass, then climbing away using superior climb rate. This tactic worked when conditions permitted, but conditions often didn't permit. At lower altitudes, where most combat occurred, the Spitfire could climb with the Messerschmitt in sustained climbs. The Bf 109 had better initial climb rate, but the Spitfire had better sustained climb performance. After the first 30 seconds of climb, the Spitfire was actually climbing faster because it could maintain a higher angle of attack without stalling. Pilots who understood these characteristics could defeat supposedly superior opponents consistently. Flight Lieutenant Bob Doe, who shot down 14 German aircraft during the Battle of Britain, explained his technique. When a 109 dove on me, I'd turn hard toward him. He couldn't follow through the turn. When he tried to climb away, I'd follow him in a sustained climb. Eventually, he'd either have to turn, which gave me the advantage, or run for home. This tactical flexibility, the ability to dictate the terms of combat, was the Spitfire's greatest strength. The Messerschmitt pilot had to execute his planned attack perfectly, or disengage. The Spitfire pilot could adapt, could turn a defensive situation into an offensive one, could stay in the fight until he found an opportunity. September 15th, the decisive day, September 15th, 1940, became the climactic day of the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe launched its largest attacks yet, attempting to destroy fighter command once and for all. Over 1,500 German aircraft crossed the English Channel in 2 massive waves. RAF Fighter Command scrambled every available fighter. 23 squadrons engaged the morning raid. 31 squadrons engaged the afternoon raid. For the first time, the Germans faced opposition in depth. No matter how many fighters they sent, the RAF had more Spitfires and Hurricanes rising to meet them. The morning raid developed over London around 11:30. Spitfire squadrons from 11 Group intercepted the German fighters, while Hurricane squadrons attacked the bombers. The Messerschmitts, tasked with protecting the bombers, found themselves unable to effectively engage the Spitfires. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, flying with 501 Squadron, described the morning combat. The 109s tried to stay above us, diving when they saw opportunities, but we climbed quickly and stayed with them. Several times they broke off attacks on our bombers because they were being engaged by Spitfires. Their speed advantage didn't help because they couldn't disengage while we were in climbing position. The afternoon raid, even larger, received similar treatment. 40 Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons engaged the German formation. The Luftwaffe, expecting to face a depleted and demoralized opponent, instead met the full strength of fighter command. The results were devastating for German hopes. The Luftwaffe lost 56 aircraft, though they initially claimed much lower losses. Fighter command lost 29 aircraft, but most pilots survived. More importantly, the psychological victory was complete. German bomber crews, seeing Spitfires appearing in waves despite Luftwaffe claims to have destroyed fighter command, realized the battle was lost. The morale impact was immediate and severe. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, had promised that no British fighter would survive to oppose the invasion. On September 15th, that promise was exposed as fantasy. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. Without air superiority, invasion was impossible. Without defeating fighter command, air superiority was impossible. And fighter command, built around Spitfires and Hurricanes that supposedly couldn't match German technical superiority, had proven undefeatable. The preference British pilots showed for their Spitfires wasn't sentimental or nationalistic. It was based on hard combat experience. The Spitfire kept them alive. It gave them advantages in the combats they actually fought, not in theoretical scenarios. It was slower in level flight than the Bf 109, but that didn't matter because level flight wasn't where battles were won. If you're enjoying this deep dive into why the slower Spitfire was actually superior, hit that subscribe button right now. We're about to explore the technical details that made the Spitfire special and the German engineering mistakes that made the Bf 109 vulnerable. Don't miss what comes next. The Merlin engine, reliability over raw power. The Rolls-Royce. Merlin engine that powered the Spitfire represented a different engineering philosophy than the Daimler-Benz DB601 that powered the Bf 109. The differences extended beyond mere horsepower numbers. The Merlin was designed for reliability and smooth power delivery. Its V12 configuration, liquid-cooled, produced around 1,030 horsepower in early versions. This was slightly less than the DB601's 1,175 horsepower. But the Merlin delivered its power more consistently across its operating range. More critically, the Merlin could tolerate combat damage that would destroy the German engine. The Merlin's cooling system, while vulnerable to damage, was more robust than the DB601. A single coolant line hit wouldn't immediately cause engine failure. Pilots could often nurse damaged Merlins back to base. The DB601, despite its higher power output, was less forgiving. Its fuel injection system, technologically advanced, was also complex and fragile. Combat damage to fuel lines or injection pumps usually meant immediate engine failure. Its cooling system, optimized for efficiency, couldn't tolerate damage well. British pilots quickly learned they could absorb more punishment than their German opponents. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, the legless ace who commanded 242 Squadron, regularly returned with aircraft showing substantial battle damage. His after-action reports noted that the Merlin kept running when German engines would have failed. The maintenance requirements also differed significantly. The Merlin could operate for longer between overhauls. Its simpler fuel system meant fewer mechanical failures. Ground crews could replace a damaged Merlin in about 24 hours. The DB601 required more frequent maintenance and longer replacement times. During the Battle of Britain, this reliability difference was critical. RAF squadrons could keep higher percentages of their Spitfires operational. German squadrons struggled with serviceability rates as combat damage and maintenance needs reduced available aircraft. By September 1940, Fighter Command was maintaining about 75% serviceability across Spitfire squadrons. Luftwaffe fighter units were averaging 60% serviceability. This 15% difference translated to significant numerical advantages for the RAF, despite having fewer total aircraft. The armament debate, rifle caliber versus cannon, the Spitfire's armament, 8 303 caliber Browning machine guns, was often criticized as inadequate compared to the Bf-109's combination of machine guns and 20mm cannon. On paper, the German armament appeared superior. In practice, the situation was more complex. The Spitfire's 8 machine guns fired approximately 10,000 rounds per minute combined at typical combat ranges of 200 to 400 yards. This created a dense cone of fire that was difficult to miss with. The 303 rounds, while individually less destructive than cannon shells, were effective against aircraft structures and systems. More importantly, the lighter armament meant the Spitfire carried more ammunition. 8 guns with 300 rounds each provided 2,400 total rounds. At the maximum rate of fire, this gave about 14 seconds of continuous firing, though pilots typically fired in short bursts. The Bf-109's cannon, while devastating when hits were achieved, had severe limitations. The MGFF 20mm cannon carried only 60 rounds per gun. At 120 rounds per minute rate of fire, each cannon had only 30 seconds of ammunition. Combined with two 92mm machine guns with 1,000 rounds each, the pilot had to be very selective about when to fire. The cannon installation also created problems. Firing the cannon produced significant vibration and required the pilot to readjust his aim after each burst. The armament made the Bf-109 more nose-heavy, affecting handling characteristics. Flight Lieutenant Al Deer, after examining a captured Bf-109, noted that their cannon are impressive when they hit, but they only get a few shots. Our 8 machine guns might need more hits to destroy an aircraft, but we can afford to miss more often. In combat, that matters. Statistical analysis supported this observation. RAF pilots reported that successful deflection shots, firing at a target that was turning or maneuvering, were more common with the Spitfire than German pilots reported with the Bf-109. The high rate of fire and ammunition capacity meant Spitfire pilots could put rounds in the general area of the target and score hits through volume of fire. The Bf-109 pilot, conserving his limited cannon ammunition, often held fire, hoping for a perfect shot. This sometimes meant missing opportunities. The psychological pressure of limited ammunition also affected performance. Pilots, knowing they had only a few seconds of firing time, often rushed their shots and missed. By 1941, the RAF began introducing cannon-armed Spitfires, but many pilots preferred the machine gun armament. Squadron leader Sailor Malan, one of the RAF's top aces with 32 kills, flew both versions and concluded that for fighter versus fighter combat, I prefer the machine guns. More ammunition, higher rate of fire, and reliable feeding make them more practical. Control harmony. The invisible advantage. Perhaps the most important difference between the Spitfire and Bf 109, and the hardest to quantify, was what pilots called control harmony. This referred to how naturally and predictably the aircraft responded to control inputs. The Spitfire was legendary for its harmonious controls. All three axes, pitch, roll, and yaw, required similar force levels. Moving the stick right produced a roll rate proportional to the deflection. Moving it forward produced pitch rate proportional to the movement. The rudder required appropriate force for coordinated flight. This harmony meant pilots could fly the Spitfire intuitively. After a few hours of familiarization, control movements became unconscious. The pilot thought about where he wanted to go, and the aircraft went there. The Spitfire didn't require conscious attention to stay coordinated or trimmed. The Bf 109 had less harmonious controls. The ailerons were heavy at high speed, requiring significant force to roll. The elevator was lighter, sometimes too light, making precise pitch control difficult at high speed. The aircraft required constant trim adjustment as speed and power changed. These characteristics made the Bf 109 more fatiguing to fly, especially in combat. Pilots had to consciously manage trim, consciously coordinate controls, consciously compensate for the aircraft's handling characteristics. This mental workload reduced situational awareness and slowed reaction times. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown, who flew both types extensively, provided the definitive comparison. The Spitfire is a delight to fly. Everything works together naturally. The 109 is a fine aircraft, but it requires more attention from the pilot. In combat, when your attention should be on the enemy, this difference is significant. German pilots who flew captured Spitfires universally praised its handling. Oberleutnant Heinz Konoka wrote that the Spitfire is easier to fly than our Messerschmitt. It is more forgiving of pilot errors. It does not have the nasty habits that the 109 sometimes displays. If our fighters handled like this, we would be more effective. But German aircraft development continued prioritizing performance specifications over handling qualities. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, introduced in 1941, was faster and more heavily armed than the Bf 109, but had similar handling quirks. The Bf 109 F and G models with more powerful engines actually had worse handling than earlier versions due to increased weight. The British, conversely, maintained the Spitfire's handling characteristics through all its development. The Mark IX, with a more powerful Merlin engine, flew almost identically to the Mark I. The Mark XIV, with the powerful Griffin engine, required more muscle but retained the same control harmony. This consistency meant experienced Spitfire pilots could transition to new marks with minimal retraining. The same techniques, the same instincts, the same muscle memory applied. German pilots transitioning from early to late model Bf 109s had to relearn handling characteristics. The forgotten factor. Pilot fatigue combat, flying is exhausting. The G-forces, the oxygen deprivation at altitude, the mental stress of mortal combat, all combine to create severe physical and mental fatigue. Aircraft design can either mitigate or exacerbate this fatigue. The Spitfire's design minimized pilot fatigue. Its harmonious controls meant less physical effort. Its smooth power delivery meant less trim adjustment. Its good visibility meant less neck strain from constantly checking blind spots. Its comfortable cockpit meant less discomfort during extended missions. The Bf 109 was more fatiguing to fly. Its heavier controls required more muscle. Its tendency to require constant trim adjustment demanded continuous attention. Its limited visibility forced pilots to constantly crane their necks checking blind spots. Its cramped cockpit became uncomfortable quickly. During the Battle of Britain, RAF pilots sometimes flew 4 or 5 sorties per day. Each sortie might last an hour or more. The cumulative fatigue was enormous. Any aircraft characteristic that increased fatigue reduced effectiveness later in the day. Flight Lieutenant Tom Neal, who flew Hurricanes during the battle, noted that by the 4th sortie of the day, you were flying on autopilot. Physical exhaustion, mental fatigue, and stress dulled your reactions. An aircraft that was easy to fly made the difference between maintaining effectiveness and becoming a liability. German pilots faced similar fatigue, but with a disadvantage. Their Bf-109s required more conscious effort to fly well. As fatigue set in, their handling deteriorated more noticeably. Pilots made more trim errors, more coordination errors, more judgment errors. The statistics suggested this effect was real. German accident rates increased significantly during periods of intensive operations. Landing accidents, in particular, spiked when pilots were flying multiple sorties daily. The Bf-109's narrow landing gear, combined with pilot fatigue, created a dangerous combination. RAF accident rates, while certainly elevated during intensive periods, didn't spike as dramatically. The Spitfire's wide landing gear and forgiving handling meant fatigued pilots could still land safely most of the time. November 1940, lessons learned and ignored. By November, the Battle of Britain had essentially ended. The Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing, acknowledging that daylight operations against fighter command were unsustainable. The Germans had lost approximately 1,700 aircraft. Fighter command had lost about 1,000 aircraft, but had maintained operational capability. Luftwaffe intelligence conducted extensive analysis, trying to understand their failure. Technical commissions examined captured Spitfires. Interrogators questioned downed RAF pilots. Senior officers reviewed tactical reports and loss statistics. The conclusions should have been obvious. The Spitfire, despite being slower in level flight, was superior in the combat conditions that actually occurred. Its maneuverability, handling, reliability, and pilot-friendly characteristics outweighed the Bf-109's advantages in speed and firepower. Some German officers understood this. Major Adolf Galland submitted a report stating that British fighters, particularly the Spitfire, are equal or superior to our Messerschmitt in most combat scenarios. We must develop fighters with better maneuverability and handling characteristics, not just higher performance specifications. Galland's report was essentially ignored. German aircraft development continued prioritizing speed, climb rate, and firepower over maneuverability and handling. The assumption remained that technical superiority, measured in horsepower and top speed, would eventually prevail. This thinking led to a series of German fighters that repeated the Bf-109's mistakes. The Fokke Wolf FW-190A, introduced in 1941, was faster and more heavily armed than the Spitfire Mark V, but couldn't turn with it. The Bf-109G, introduced in 1942, was even faster but had worse handling than earlier models. The British took the opposite approach. Each new Spitfire variant maintained the handling characteristics that made the original successful. The Mark IX, introduced to counter the FW-190, was faster than earlier Spitfires, but retained superior maneuverability. The Mark XIV, with a 2,000 horsepower Griffon engine, could match German fighters in speed while maintaining the turning ability that German fighters lacked. By 1943, German pilots were reporting that they still couldn't outturn Spitfires despite having newer, more powerful aircraft. Lieutenant Hans Philipp, a veteran ace, wrote that the latest Spitfires are as maneuverable as ever. Our new aircraft are faster, but this doesn't help in turning combat. We need fighters that can turn with the British, not just fly faster in straight lines. But German engineering culture couldn't adapt. The emphasis on measurable performance metrics, on specifications that looked impressive on paper, was too deeply ingrained. The understanding that combat effectiveness wasn't captured by horsepower and top speed numbers never penetrated to the decision-makers. The Spitfire evolution, staying true to principles. From 1940 through 1945, the Spitfire went through numerous marks and variants. Engine power increased from 1,000 horsepower to over 2,000. Armament evolved from 8 machine guns to various combinations of machine guns and cannon. Speed increased from 360 miles per hour to over 450 miles per hour. But through all these changes, R.J. Mitchell's basic design philosophy remained intact. The elliptical wing was retained. The wide track landing gear stayed. The bubble canopy continued. The harmonious controls were preserved. The focus on maneuverability and handling over pure speed continued. This consistency gave the Spitfire remarkable longevity. The last operational Spitfire sortie was flown in 1954 by the Royal Thai Air Force. No other World War II fighter remained in frontline service that long. The basic design was so sound that it could be continuously upgraded for 15 years. The Bf 109 also evolved, but less successfully. Later models became increasingly difficult to fly. The G and K variants, with more powerful engines and heavier armament, were faster than ever, but had handling characteristics that scared even experienced pilots. German ace Günther Rall described the late model 109 as a widowmaker. It had enormous power, but was unforgiving of pilot errors. The swing on takeoff could kill you. The stall characteristics were vicious. It was fast, but only experienced pilots could extract that performance safely. The Spitfire never developed such a reputation. Even the powerful Mark 14 and Mark 24, despite their increased power and weight, remained controllable by average pilots. The design philosophy of making the aircraft work for the pilot rather than requiring the pilot to fight the aircraft paid dividends throughout the war. Before we wrap up this story, I want to ask you one more time to subscribe if you haven't already. Understanding why the Spitfire was preferred over faster German fighters teaches us important lessons about how specifications don't tell the whole story. Hit that button and join us for more deep dives into the engineering and human stories behind World War II's most important technologies. The numbers that mattered versus the numbers that didn't at war's end. Statistical analysis revealed which performance characteristics actually correlated with combat success and which didn't. Top speed, the metric German engineers prioritized, showed weak correlation with combat effectiveness. Pilots rarely flew at maximum speed in combat. Most engagements occurred between 200 and 300 miles per hour. Speeds where both Spitfires and Messerschmitts performed adequately. Turn rate and turn radius, metrics that favored the Spitfire, showed strong correlation with combat success. Pilots who could turn inside their opponents consistently achieved better kill-to-loss ratios. The Spitfire's advantage in sustained turning translated directly to combat superiority. Handling qualities, impossible to measure with simple metrics, showed the strongest correlation with success. Aircraft that were easy to fly, that didn't require constant attention to stay controlled, that forgave pilot errors, consistently outperformed aircraft with better specifications but worse handling. The British had accidentally, or perhaps intuitively, prioritized the right characteristics. Their insistence on maneuverability and handling, their willingness to accept slightly lower top speeds in exchange for better turning, their focus on making the Spitfire easy and pleasant to fly, all these decisions proved correct in combat. The Germans had prioritized the wrong characteristics, their focus on top speed and firepower, their acceptance of difficult handling in exchange for better performance specifications, their emphasis on measurable metrics over pilot opinion, All these decisions proved counterproductive. The irony is that German engineering was more sophisticated than British engineering in many ways. The DB601 engine with its fuel injection was more advanced than the Merlin with its carburetors. The Bf-109's construction was more modern than the Spitfires. German manufacturing techniques were more efficient, but sophisticated engineering that prioritizes the wrong goals produces inferior results. The Spitfire, with its relatively simple design and conservative engineering, was more effective because it prioritized the things that actually mattered in combat. This lesson, that technical sophistication doesn't guarantee practical superiority, was repeated throughout World War II. The German Tiger tank was technically superior to the American Sherman, but less effective in combat. The German Type 21 U-boat was technically superior to Allied submarines, but came too late to matter. The German V weapons were technical marvels that accomplished nothing strategic. The Allies, particularly the Americans and British, consistently prioritized practical effectiveness over technical impressiveness. Their equipment wasn't always the most sophisticated, but it was usually good enough and available in sufficient quantities. This pragmatic approach won the war. Pilot testimony. The final verdict. The strongest evidence for Spitfire superiority comes from the pilots themselves. British pilots who flew Spitfires loved them. German pilots who flew captured Spitfires praised them. Post-war, when honest assessment became possible, even former Luftwaffe pilots acknowledged the Spitfire's superiority. Squadron leader Johnny Johnson, the RAF's top-scoring ace against German fighters with 34 kills, flew Spitfires throughout his combat career. After the war, he was asked why he preferred the Spitfire to other fighters he'd flown. His answer was simple. It did everything I needed it to do. It turned well. It climbed well. It was reliable. I could see out of it. I trusted it completely. What more could you want? Flight Lieutenant Pierre Clostermann, a Free French pilot who flew Spitfires with the RAF and later flew Hawker Tempests, wrote in his memoir that the Spitfire was the perfect fighter. The Tempest was faster and more heavily armed, but I always felt safer in a Spitfire. It was more maneuverable, easier to fly, and more likely to bring me home. German testimony was equally revealing. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, after flying a captured Spitfire Mark V in 1942, reported that the Spitfire has better visibility, better handling, and better maneuverability than our Bf-109. In combat at our typical fighting altitudes, it is the superior fighter. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, who flew captured Spitfires multiple times, wrote that flying the Spitfire makes clear why British pilots are so effective. The aircraft is simply easier to fly and more capable in turning combat. If we had Spitfires, we would be more dangerous. If they had Messerschmitts, they would be less dangerous. These testimonies from pilots who had nothing to gain from dishonesty provide the clearest evidence. The Spitfire was preferred not because of nationalism or sentimentality, but because it was genuinely better at the things that mattered in combat. The slow Spitfire, slower than the Bf-109 in level flight, was actually faster in the ways that counted, faster into position, faster through turns, faster to respond to threats, and most importantly, faster to give its pilot the advantage needed to survive and win. The engineering philosophy, a fundamental divide. The Spitfire versus Bf-109 comparison reveals a fundamental philosophical divide in engineering approach. This divide extended far beyond these two aircraft and characterized the broader Allied versus Axis technological competition. The German approach was to engineer the theoretical optimum, design for maximum performance in ideal conditions, prioritize measurable specifications, accept complexity and difficulty in exchange for peak capability. This approach produced impressive machinery that looked dominant on paper. The Allied approach, particularly British, was to engineer the practical optimum, design for reliable performance in real conditions, prioritize characteristics that mattered in actual use, accept slightly lower specifications in exchange for usability and reliability. This approach produced machinery that might look less impressive on paper, but performed better in practice. These philosophies reflected different cultural values. German engineering culture valued precision, technical sophistication, and pursuit of perfection. Allied engineering culture valued pragmatism, reliability, and good enough is good enough if it works. Neither approach was inherently superior. In different contexts, each had advantages. For a racing car or a land speed record aircraft, the German approach of maximizing performance, regardless of other considerations, makes sense. For military equipment that must work reliably in harsh conditions operated by average people, the Allied approach proved more effective. The Spitfire embodied Allied pragmatism. It wasn't the fastest possible fighter. It wasn't the most heavily armed. It wasn't the most technically sophisticated. But it was fast enough, armed enough, and sophisticated enough, while being reliable, maneuverable, and easy to fly. This combination proved more valuable than any single maximum specification. The Bf 109 embodied German perfectionism. It was designed to maximize speed and climb rate. These goals were achieved, but at the cost of handling, visibility, and ease of use. The result was an aircraft that looked better on paper, but was worse in combat. This pattern repeated across German versus Allied technology. German tanks were more heavily armed and armored, but less reliable and harder to maintain. German U-boats were more sophisticated, but more complex and fragile. German small arms were more precisely manufactured, but more prone to jamming in harsh conditions. The Allies consistently traded peak performance for reliability and usability. Their equipment wasn't always the best in any single category, but it was consistently good enough in all categories and could be produced in quantity and kept running under field conditions. The legacy? Lessons that resonate today. The Spitfire's success offers lessons that remain relevant today. These lessons transcend aviation and apply to engineering, product design, and organizational decision-making broadly. First, specifications don't tell the whole story. The Bf 109 looked better on paper. The Spitfire performed better in practice. Organizations that make decisions based solely on measurable metrics often choose the wrong option. Some of the most important characteristics, like ease of use and reliability, are hardest to quantify. Second, context matters more than absolute capability. The Spitfire wasn't the fastest fighter possible. It was the right fighter for the combat conditions that actually occurred. Engineering for the expected use case, rather than for theoretical maximum performance, produces better results. Third, user experience determines effectiveness. The Spitfire was designed around pilot needs. The Bf 109 was designed around performance specifications. The user-focused design proved superior. This lesson applies to any product or system where human operation is critical. Fourth, simple and reliable beats complex and sophisticated. The Spitfire's straightforward design and conservative engineering made it more effective than the Bf 109's advanced technology. Complexity is only valuable if it enhances practical performance. Often it merely creates failure points and maintenance burdens. Fifth, continuous improvement beats revolutionary redesign. The Spitfire evolved incrementally, maintaining its basic characteristics while improving performance. This approach proved more successful than German attempts to design entirely new fighters. Sometimes refining what works is better than starting over. These lessons challenged conventional wisdom in 1940 and still challenge it today. The belief that faster is always better, that more power is always superior, that technical sophistication indicates superiority remains widespread. The Spitfire's success proves these assumptions wrong. Modern fighter aircraft development sometimes forgets these lessons. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, for example, prioritized specifications and multi-role capability over ease of use and cost-effectiveness. The result is a technically sophisticated aircraft that many pilots find harder to fly and maintain than the aircraft it replaces. The Spitfire reminds us that the goal isn't the most impressive specifications. The goal is the most effective system for the actual mission. Technical sophistication that doesn't enhance mission effectiveness is just expensive complexity. Conclusion: the wisdom of slower speed. The British pilots who preferred their slow Spitfires over Germany's faster fighters weren't wrong. They weren't sentimental, they weren't biased by nationalism, they were absolutely correct based on combat experience. The Spitfire was slower in level flight. It produced less horsepower. It carried lighter armament. On paper, it looked inferior. In combat, it was superior. Superior in the ways that actually determined who lived and who died, who won and who lost. The Spitfire could outturn the Bf-109. It could outclimb it in sustained climbs. It was easier to fly, easier to land, easier to maintain. It provided better visibility. It was more reliable. It was more forgiving of pilot errors. It was less fatiguing to fly. It was more pleasant to operate. All these advantages, none of which showed up clearly in specification sheets, combined to make the Spitfire the better fighter. British pilots understood this through experience. They didn't need performance numbers to tell them which aircraft kept them alive and which aircraft gave them advantages in combat. The Germans, trapped by their faith in technical specifications and measurable performance, never fully grasped this. They kept building faster fighters with more powerful engines and heavier armament. They kept expecting that superior numbers on paper would translate to superior performance in combat. They kept being wrong. The Battle of Britain was decided not by which side had the fastest fighters, but by which side had the best fighters. Speed, it turned out, wasn't everything. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it was actively counterproductive if it came at the cost of characteristics that actually mattered. Flight Lieutenant Ginger Lacey, the pilot we met at the beginning turning inside a Messerschmitt above Kent, summed it up perfectly in a post-war interview. The 109 was faster than my Spitfire. So what? I could outturn it. I could outclimb it. I could see better. I could shoot more rounds. When the fight was over, I was alive and he was dead. That's all that matters. He can have his extra 20 miles per hour. I'll take the aircraft that wins fights. The Spitfire won fights not through superior specifications, but through superior design philosophy. R.J. Mitchell and his team had understood something fundamental. Fighter combat isn't about flying fast in straight lines. It's about turning, positioning, seeing, shooting, and surviving. Design the aircraft for what actually happens in combat, not for what looks impressive in a specifications table. This wisdom, proven over British skies in 1940, validated in thousands of combats through 1945, remains relevant. The best solution isn't always the most technically impressive. The best tool isn't always the one with the highest numbers. The best design isn't always the most sophisticated. Sometimes the best choice is the one that might look slower or simpler, but actually performs better where it matters. The British pilots who preferred their Spitfires understood this instinctively. They weren't fooled by German fighters' superior specifications. They knew from hard experience that combat effectiveness came from characteristics the specification sheets didn't capture. The Spitfire's elliptical wings cut through the air above Britain, not as a statement of technical superiority, but as proof of design wisdom. Slower didn't mean worse. Different priorities didn't mean wrong priorities. And in the end, the aircraft designed to fight rather than to impress won the battle, won the respect of its pilots, and earned its place as one of history's finest fighters. Not through speed, but through everything that actually mattered.